Did you know that the roots of modern civilization might trace back to Africa? Cheikh Anta Diop's groundbreaking work challenges everything we thought we knew about history and reveals the untold story of origins of blacks and black civilization that shaped the world. Stay tuned to discover how ancient Egypt's legacy could change the way we see history forever. The Greeks and Jews saw the ancient Egyptians firsthand before they became mixed with Greek and Arab blood. They never thought of them as looking like the people in the Middle East or Europe. They saw them as cousins of the Ethiopians and used the word black when talking about them, or for example, when Herodotus argues that the people on the island of Colchis came from Egypt, he says, "The Egyptians said they believed the Colchians to be descended from the army of Sesostris." My own conjectures were founded, first, on the fact that they are black-skinned and have woolly hair. One of the reasons he gives for why the rising of the Nile is not caused by melting snow is that it is certain that the natives of the country are black with the heat. When talking about an oracle, he uses the blackness of a dove to argue that it stands for an Egyptian woman. Some say Herodotus was simply a teller of tales, yet he was careful to point out what he saw with his own eyes, what he heard and what made sense. Egypt is something he saw with his own eyes. Archaeology continues to back up his eyewitness accounts. Herodotus said that Egypt was the cradle of civilization, that the Greeks got all the elements of their civilization from Egypt, even their gods. The Greeks, Herodotus, Diodorus of Sicily and Strabo all believed that the Egyptians and Ethiopians were of the same race, that either the Egyptians came from the Ethiopians or the Ethiopians came from the Egyptians, depending on whether they saw the Nile as being settled upstream or downstream. It was not just the Greeks. The Jews who wrote the Bible saw it pretty much the same way too. For example, they said that after the flood Egypt and Ethiopia were both settled by the sons of Ham. Whence came this name Ham, Chem, Chem? Where could Moses have found it? Right in Egypt, where Moses was born, grew up and lived until the Exodus. In fact, we know the Egyptians called their country Kemet, which means black in their language. The interpretation according to which Kemet designates the black soil of Egypt, rather than the black man and, by extension, the black race of the country of the blacks, stems from a gratuitous distortion by minds aware of what an exact interpretation of this word would imply. Hence it is natural to find Chem in Hebrew, meaning heat, black, burned. Diop says that the Jews got most of the elements of their civilization from Egypt too. They came to Egypt as a small band of shepherds in the time of Joseph and lived there for 400 years. Their belief in one God, for example, goes back to that of Akhenaten, who ruled Egypt about 100 years before Moses. The Negro myth is the belief that black people are not as good as whites. And not just in this period of history in certain particular ways, like in weapons or wealth, but in most ways throughout all of history. Because, the myth says, blacks lack brains, morals, reason, civilization, working constitutional government and all the rest. The myth is so firmly believed that when whites do admit that blacks can equal or pass them in something, like music or art, it is strangely twisted into proof that blacks are less than fully human, and that they have more of an animal-like nature. The myth is so firmly believed that the idea of ancient Egypt being a black civilization seems highly improbable if not laughable. So much so that when archaeologists find the remains of blacks in Egypt or the Middle East, they are assumed, without the trouble of a proof, to be slaves. The myth is so firmly believed that whites saw it as their duty to civilize blacks for their own good, the white man's burden. The myth is so firmly believed that even top black thinkers sometimes believe in it. Leopold Sédar Senghor, for example, once said, "Emotion is Negro and reason Greek." While M. Césaire pictured blacks as those who invented neither gunpowder nor compass, those who tamed neither steam nor electricity, those who explored neither the sea nor the sky. The birth of the myth. When Egypt fell under foreign rule from about -500 onwards, most of Africa became cut off from the rest of the world for 2000 years. Since people there could make a comfortable living with just a hoe, they fell behind in terms of material progress, though they continued to progress in other ways. Constitutional government, for example, was common in West Africa before it was common in Europe. When Europeans arrived in West Africa in the 1400s, they had far better weapons and ships than anyone in that part of the world. They used this advantage to rob Africa of its riches and make its people into slaves. Europeans assumed that their material advantage extended to morals, society, government and everything else. They also assumed this advantage extended to all of history. This caused them to misread history in certain ways. So, for example, when the French scholar Count Constantin d'Avony arrived in Egypt in the 1780s, he was shocked to find that the people there appeared to be part black, even though he knew his Herodotus. The myth started out as an understandable misunderstanding of Portuguese sailors of the 1400s. But it proved so useful an excuse for the slave trade and colonization that it got written about and in time flowered into revealed truth, part of the European mindset. In ancient times it was widely believed that Egyptians came from the Ethiopians, but in the 1800s many European scholars began to distance Egypt from Black Africa, from Africa proper. They looked to Asia or even North Africa for the seeds of Egyptian civilization. The black people found in ancient Egypt were seen as slaves in a white civilization. One of the more desperate attempts to do this was to say that Egyptian civilization came from the Libyans to the west. Libyans were light-skinned and possibly came from Europe. But the Egyptians regarded them as savages. Herodotus 2. Their women wear on each leg a ring made of bronze, they let their hair grow long, and when they catch vermin on their person, bite it and throw it away. The Libyans did in fact take over and rule Egypt for a while, but that was thousands of years after the rise of Egyptian civilization. The same goes for all the light-skinned rulers of Egypt, the Persians, Greeks, Romans, Arabs and Turks. In fact, their settling in Egypt is proof not that Egypt was white, but that it used to be much blacker than it is today. As it turns out, Egyptians painted pictures of the different people of the known world and even gave each a different skin color, putting them in this order: dark red or copper Egyptians, black Africans, tan or yellow Asians, white Europeans. Whites were not only last, they were the only ones pictured as savages, as most were back then some 3,500 years ago. European scholars jumped on this to show that the Egyptians did not regard themselves as black. Yet, as one of these very same scholars pointed out elsewhere, copper is part of the natural skin color range of black Africa. The Egyptians naturally saw themselves as being different and apart from everyone else. But they also saw themselves as being closest, in appearance and civilization, to Africa proper and farthest from whites. It was not just skin color either, but even their features. Nose short and flesh. Mouth stretched a bit too far. Thick lips. Large eyes open wide. And that in the words of a scholar who tried to prove the Egyptians were not black. For comparison, here is how Egyptians pictured white people, in the words of Champollion. A white skin of the most delicate shade, a nose straight or slightly arched, blue eyes, blonde or reddish beard, tall stature and very slender, clad in a hairy ox skin, a veritable savage, tattooed on various parts of his body. The Egyptians also painted their gods black. Isis, for example, always has the skin color of a Nubian. If Egypt was a white civilization with black slaves, then why the black gods? Most people paint gods in their own image, not that of their slaves. Diop argues that Egyptian civilization did not first appear in the Nile Delta. Some scholars, interested in proving that Egypt got its civilization from light-skinned outsiders, have argued that it began in the Delta. After all, if civilization came from Asia, North Africa, and Europe or over the Mediterranean Sea, then it would appear first in the delta and then spread up the Nile to Upper Egypt. Diop says there are no hard facts to support this. True, the delta is far wetter, so less comes down to us there from ancient times, yet even wood is able to last there for up to 4,000 years. So there should be at least some hard facts in its favor. Instead, it is a theory without any hard facts to support it. If the facts are simply missing due to wetness or bad luck, then the history of Upper Egypt should not make complete sense on its own. But it does. Civilization arises there step by step. Its archaeological record goes back over 9,000 years without any break that a delta origin of civilization would help us to understand. The pharaohs mostly ruled from Thebes in Upper Egypt. When they ruled from Memphis near the delta, it was for military reasons. And even then, when the pharaoh died, they sent his body back to Upper Egypt to be buried. Upper Egypt, particularly in and near Thebes, was the center of Egyptian religion. The worship of Osiris was centered there. The oldest books have the gods coming from Upper Egypt or further south, never from the delta. The first fight between Set and Horus took place in Nubia to the south. All this makes sense if, as the ancients believed, Egyptians came from Ethiopia. Or if Egyptian civilization simply started in Upper Egypt. But if the gods came from the delta, as some maintain, it would make little sense. Other reasons that run counter to a delta origin of Egyptian civilization. Egypt has always been mainly a land power, not a sea power. Which would be odd if it was born in the delta, right near the Mediterranean Sea. The delta became habitable and Memphis even possible due to advanced public works upriver in Upper Egypt. The delta was subject to war and plague far more than Upper Egypt, making it a less favorable place for civilization to start. Some argue that the Egyptian calendar started in Memphis because that is where the sun and Sirius seemed to rise together. Yet that same calendar's oldest known date is 4236 BC, 1,000 years before the founding of Memphis, back when the place where Memphis was to be built still stood under water. In short, a delta origin, instead of making better sense of what we know about Egypt, makes it more of a mystery. Diop, writing in the early 1950s, said that Egyptian civilization did not come from Asia. There is no solid proof of any advanced civilization in Asia old enough to account for the rise of Egyptian civilization. Ancient writers regarded Egyptian civilization as much older than anything in Asia. They saw Mesopotamian civilization as coming from Africa. Astronomical calculations put the rise of Mesopotamia in the 2500s. That is 600 years after Egypt. Yet in Diop's time it was widely believed that Egypt and Mesopotamia arose at the same time. Why? Georges Contenot, a French archaeologist at the Louvre, put it this way. It is difficult to explain how Egyptian civilization, which Egyptologists, in the most moderate estimates, start around 3100 BC, could have preceded Mesopotamian history by 600 years. In other words, the Asian origin was assumed rather than proved. Millions were spent in trying to find the birth of civilization in Asia. Ancient remains in tombs were called kings when they may have been merely town headmen or even human sacrifices. Nothing was found that even begins to approach the scale of what Egypt had at the time, like, say, pyramids. And if by Asian origin one means white, it becomes even more improbable. Before -1500 the people in the region stretching from North Africa through the Middle East to India were largely black or part black. They were not nearly as light-skinned or white-looking as they are today. The region had not yet gone through thousands of years of white-skinned barbarians coming down from the north in wave after wave. Carthage, Egypt, Phoenicia, Elam and Indus were all black or part black civilizations. You see it in their pictures and their skulls. You see it in the way the Greeks and Jews compare them or tie them to Ethiopians or Africans, which seems improbable to us today, but apparently it did not seem so at the time. The Bible, for example, says, "And the sons of Ham, Cush, and Mizraim, and Phat, and Canaan. And Cush begot Nimrod, he began to be a mighty one in the earth. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh, in the land of Shinar. Which sees the people of Egypt, Mizraim, Phoenicia, Canaan, Sudan, Cush, and Mesopotamia, Shinar, as being peopled by the sons of Ham. Ham means black, not by the sons of Shem, Semites, like the Jews themselves. Notice that it is the sons of Ham who founded the cities, like Babel, at a time when the Jews were still shepherds. The Semites as we know them today, the Jews and Arabs, were created from a mix of civilized dark-skinned people from Africa and barbarian white-skinned West Eurasians. It is like what took place in India, but instead of people being separated into lighter and darker skin castes, they became thoroughly mixed over time. Diop says there is no proof from science, from physical anthropologists who measure skulls, that Egypt was mainly white at the time civilization arose there some 5,000 years ago. The schoolbooks of his time, back the early 1950s, said that Egypt was a white civilization. They said it with such authority that one would naturally suppose that it must be backed by science. But it was nothing like that. It was just wishful thinking, which millions of schoolchildren have dutifully learned as fact. This is how the minds of so many generations have been warped. It is an intellectual swindle. Thus says Diop, if you look through the scientific literature there was no proof that Egypt was mostly white. That for two reasons. First, it is hard to clearly tell race from measuring skulls. For example, one way of measuring skulls showed that Egypt was about a fourth black. But that same way of measuring skulls would also show that England was 30% black and that Black Africa was only 29% black. Second, of the studies on skulls that have been carried out, none showed that Egypt was mostly white when civilization arose there. Instead, they tend to show that a fourth to a third were clearly black while most other people were mixed with black. Science has never been able to find a white Egypt. Instead, it keeps finding the skulls of people who seem to be black from the wrong periods. Some have made up for this lack of fact with half-baked reasoning. Like that the Sahara has cut off blacks from the rest of mankind, so there is no way they could have given civilization to the world, completely overlooking the fact that it is the Nile itself that is the main way across the Sahara. Or even worse, they start twisting the meanings of words. Diop says, numerous authors circumvent the difficulty by speaking of whites with red skin or whites with black skin. This does not seem incongruous to them, for, as soon as a race has created a civilization, there can be no more possibility of its being black. For example, one book on geography written for 13-year-old French schoolchildren said this. A black is distinguished less by the color of his skin, for there are whites with black skin, than by his features, thick lips, flat nose, etc. Another book speaks of whites with brown or red skin, Egyptians. Diop concludes, only by similar definitions has one been able to whiten the Egyptian race, and this is the clearest proof of its blackness. Up to this point of the book, Diop has been tearing down the idea that ancient Egypt was somehow a white civilization. For the rest of the book he will try to show that it was black, looking at the arguments both for and against. Diop says there are two main reasons to believe that ancient Egypt sprang from Black Africa. It is what the Egyptians themselves and all ancient writers believed. Ancient Egyptian culture had more in common with African cultures than with European ones. Diop says the Egyptians and the ancient writers all say that the Egyptians either came from the south or were close cousins to those who lived there. That south has been called different things by different people. Nubia, that's Diop. Ethiopia, that's Herodotus. Cush, that's the Bible, and so on. They all mean the same place. In fact, Archaeologists were able to find its capital based on the writings of Herodotus and Diodorus of Sicily, Meroe. Meroe is along the Nile in what we now call northern Sudan, not far from present-day Ethiopia. It was found to have 80 pyramids. The ruins of Meroe, in Diop's model, the Egyptians came downriver from Nubia. When Egypt fell under foreign rule from -500 onwards, Nubia became the center of African civilization. In time it spread westward across the grassland south of the Sahara, leading to the West African civilizations of Ghana, Mali, Songhai, etc. In the white colonialist model of history, all civilization in Africa is due to light-skinned outsiders, thus Nubia was civilized by the Libyans, of all people, and West Africa by the Arabs. Ancient Egypt had a culture much more like that of Black Africa than Europe. It had things like circumcision, matriarchy and totemism, which are common in Africa but rare in Europe. By matriarchy, Diop means property and leadership passing through the mother's side of the family rather than the father's. Even something like queens, therefore, were way more common in Africa than in Europe in ancient times. Or take circumcision. Muslims and Jews practice it outside of Africa, but it does not fit into any broader picture of the world. In Africa it does. Both boys and girls had part of their genitals cut off to make them more clearly male and female, unlike the gods. The Jewish, and therefore Muslim, practice seems to come from Africa by way of Egypt. In religion, the Egyptians had many of the same gods as the Nubians and painted them black. Some of the stories of the gods take place in Nubia. All that would be rather odd if their religion came from Asia or Europe. As to language, Diop noticed that even his native West African language of Wolof has certain features in common with ancient Egyptian that cannot be accounted for by mere chance. For example, most of the pronouns are the same, the passive voice is formed by U or W, and some words are a letter off from the same words in Egyptian: lad/ned, to ask, funa/fula, regular, lo/no, protect, hide, etc. Reasons why ancient Egypt could not have sprung from Black Africa. Blacks are backwards and incapable of high civilization on their own. Mummies had straight hair. Egyptians painted themselves dark red, not black, in pictures. Blacks were slaves in ancient times. The Stela of Philae calls the people south of Egypt blacks. Take each in turn. 1. Blacks are backwards and incapable of high civilization on their own. West Africa was arguably more advanced than Western Europe in the 1300s. The accounts of Arabs in the 1300s and the first Portuguese to arrive there in the 1400s make that clear. Further, Ibn Battuta, traveling through West Africa in the 1350s, said the roads were completely safe, no one tried to rob him, and that the Negroes are of all peoples those who most abhor injustice. It was Europe's advantage in ships and guns after 1500 that changed all that, allowing it to dominate the continent and to falsify the Negro's personality. That is how things still stand, and that is what has caused the subsequent alteration of history concerning the origin of Egyptian civilization. It also made possible the slave trade, which both destroyed civilization in Africa and made it necessary for whites to see blacks as immoral half-animals. 2. Mummies have straight hair. At least the mummies museums like to show have straight hair. So do some blacks. But from Herodotus's description and the sort of hairstyles Egyptian women are pictured wearing, it is clear that most did not have fine, straight hair like white people. 3. Egyptians painted themselves dark red, not black, in pictures. Dark red is within the skin color range of Black Africa, not of white Europe or Asia. Even Europeans understood that is until the 1800s when it was recognized with amazement that Egypt was the mother of all civilization. Then eyesight suddenly improved and it was possible to distinguish, on the frescoes where everyone had previously recognized Negroes, evidences of a white race with red skin, a white race with dark red skin, a white race with black skin. But they never distinguished as Egyptians, a white race with white skin. This is currently the one picture on Google Images for slaves in ancient Egypt. Not only does this picture fit American ideas of race and slavery, it has been changed to fit them even better. Compare especially the head overseer. Some blacks were slaves. Yet some of the oldest pictures in Egypt show dark-skinned Egyptians taking whites as slaves. 5. The Stela of Philae calls the people south of Egypt blacks. The Stela of Philae. The Stela of Philae was a stone marker at the southern limits of Egypt. The Egyptian written on it calls people to the south Nahosi, southerners, not blacks as latter-day European mistranslation would have it. Herodotus was mistranslated the same way, some putting blacks where he said Ethiopians, giving readers the false idea that Herodotus saw Ethiopians as black and therefore different from Egyptians. The Egyptians themselves only used a black, kem, to mean themselves or their country. Diop, based on what was known in the 1950s, says that most people in Africa came from the Nile Valley, particularly in and near the country of Sudan. Today we use genetic studies to work out ancient migrations. In Diop's day that was not possible. Diop based his ideas on two things. The old stories that people in Africa told about where they came from, the names of peoples and gods that keep reappearing across Africa. Most of the old stories follow this pattern. They start out at the Great Water, cross through a land of short men, point back towards a region in or near Sudan as their starting point. The Egyptians and Nubians say they came from the south, the West Africans from the east, and the Bantu say they came from the north. So the Great Water appears to be the Nile, not the ocean. And the short men are apparently the Pygmies, who still live in the middle of Africa and who were more widespread thousands of years ago. The pattern of names shows the same. For example, there is a tribe that calls itself the Nyoro in Sudan and also one by that name far to the west in Mali. The names Gula, Gao, Gulay and Gilai appear both along the Nile and again in West Africa. There are people who call themselves Sira, Sia or Serra in Senegal, Central Africa and Chad. In those same places there are stone monuments that look like big penises. There are more such monuments to the east in a line that goes all the way to Ethiopia. Diop believes the Sira built the megaliths as they slowly moved west across Africa. One scholar, Dr. Joseph Mize, disagrees, saying this: anyone familiar with black psychology can state almost categorically that these works, which require a considerable amount of effort, without any immediate apparent usefulness, without any relationship to the natural functions of eating and copulating which alone interest the black man, have not been executed by the black race. This leads to Diop making an important point for his book as a whole. This attitude, typical of the Western world when we are concerned, shows how absolutely necessary it is for us to dig out our own past, a task that no one people can do for another, because of passions, national pride, and racial prejudice resulting from an education distorted from the ground up. Although Mize got most of his facts right, his racism affected how he made sense of them. Diop concludes, the magnitude of the doctor's errors indicates how necessary it is for us to interpret our own culture, instead of persisting in seeing it only through Western eyes. Some points Diop makes about the history of ancient Egypt from -3000 to -525. 1. The priesthood was largely independent, because they had their own lands. Sometimes the pharaoh was one of their own, but most of the time they simply acted as a state within a state. 2. Egypt never became a republic. Egypt was ruled by kings throughout. Even when the pharaoh, the king of all Egypt, fell, the idea was that in time another one would take his place. That set Egypt apart from the Greek and Roman world where revolution was common. Diop says there are two reasons for that: Egypt was too big and the masses too unlettered to stage a successful revolution across the whole country at the same time. A city here or there might be overthrown, but not the whole country. Most people in Egypt were not slaves, so most people were not desperate and determined enough to overthrow the social order. On both counts, Egypt was the opposite of many Greek city-states and, say, Haiti. 3. The whitening of Egypt. Egypt started out as unmistakably black, as made clear from the old pictures of its early pharaohs. Egyptian civilization, its mathematics, science, art, invention, architecture, religion, law, government and all the rest, were all in place by the 2600 BC, long before whites began to arrive in large numbers after 1300 BC. It has been the waves of light-skinned foreigners since then that have increasingly whitened Egypt down through the ages. Before 1300 BC, Egypt was far more advanced than Europe, Asia and Libya, the lands where whites came from. When whites did begin to arrive in large numbers, they came as barbarians, slaves, farmers and soldiers, not as a civilizing force. They had more to learn from Egypt than the other way round. But from 1300 BC to 525 BC, Egypt slowly fell behind Asia and Europe. It fought a long, losing battle to keep Egypt free from foreign rule. The Delta especially became increasingly white, not just the people, but even the army and all but the top commanders. The Egyptians called them Libyans, whether they came from Libya or not. From time to time, whites in the Delta rose up against the pharaoh, either on their own or with the help of foreign armies. Sometimes Egypt would fall apart, sometimes order would be restored from the south, either by Upper Egypt or even Nubia. Most Egyptians welcomed Nubian rule. They saw the Nubians as restoring the old ways of Egypt, bringing back the good old days. But it was not to last. In 661 Thebes, in the heart of Egypt, fell to the Assyrian army. The Assyrians did not stay, but the Persians in 525 BC did. Despite the general-sounding name of this chapter, it is mostly about how the Greek miracle, the sudden flowering of Greek civilization in the 500s BC, was no miracle at all. It only seems that way because we read history through a white lens. The ancient Greeks saw Ethiopia and Egypt as the birthplace of civilization. They saw themselves as merely building on the civilization they received from Egypt. It was not even just a case of civilization starting in Egypt and slowly spreading round the Mediterranean. Most of the top Greek minds went directly to Egypt itself to study, people like Solon, Thales, Plato, Lycurgus and Pythagoras. Later, when Alexander conquered the known world, it was Egypt that became the center of Greek thought and science. We are taught to overlook the Egyptian roots of Greek civilization. So much so that the Greek achievement seems to come out of nowhere, thus the so-called miracle. We let the Greeks take credit for things they learned from Egypt. Why? Because the Greeks are unmistakably white. Reading history that way helps to make whites look that much better and people of color that much worse. To Diop, this is one of the clearest proofs that white people deep down know that Egyptians are not truly white, certainly not white enough for their whitewashed histories. One of the main Greek advances over Egyptian civilization was science in the way we understand it, a knowledge of the world independent of religion. But even that arose almost by accident. The Greeks who studied in Egypt would remember what they were taught but throw out most of the religious mumbo-jumbo that it came with. Diop believes civilization arose along the Nile not because the people who lived there were somehow better than everyone else, but because of the special material circumstances there that favored it. Diop concludes the chapter with these words. When we say that the ancestors of the blacks, who today live mainly in Black Africa, were the first to invent mathematics, astronomy, the calendar, sciences in general, arts, religion, agriculture, social organization, medicine, writing, technique, architecture, that they were the first to erect buildings out of 6 million tons of stone, the Great Pyramid, as architects and engineers, not simply as unskilled laborers, we are merely expressing the plain, unvarnished truth that no one today can refute by arguments worthy of the name. Consequently, the black man must become able to restore the continuity of his national historic past, to draw from it the moral advantage needed to reconquer his place in the modern world, without falling into the excesses of a Nazism in reverse. For, insofar as one can speak of a race, the civilization that is his might have been created by any other human race placed in so favorable and so unique a setting. In this chapter, Diop replies to a critic of his book, Nations, Niggers, Et Culture, 1954, from which come the first 10 chapters of this book. The critic is Raymond Moni, a French historian who taught at the Sorbonne and had a particular interest in West Africa. He has been to Senegal and seen and studied some of the very same things as Diop. Diop says that it seems that Moni did not read the whole book, since he asks questions that the book itself gives answers to. Further, Moni talks about things that Diop said not in the book but in an interview, where one speaks less carefully. That aside, Moni asks why was Black Africa backwards for so long if it got its civilization from Egypt? To which Diop counters, why was Western Europe backwards for so long if it got its civilization from Rome? Or, indeed, why did Egypt itself become backwards if it got its civilization from Egypt? Moni questions whether the drawings on baobab trees of Diabel, Senegal were writing and not just pictures. Diop questions why Moni did not ask anyone who lives there what the pictures meant in order to find out whether they were mere pictures or were some kind of writing. Instead of finding out, Moni assumes. When it comes to Egypt, Moni does not take facts in their plain sense but tries to read them in a way that plays down ancient Egypt's blackness. So, when Herodotus says the Egyptians were melanochrous, black-skinned. When American anthropologist Carlton Kuhn says most were brown-skinned. When the Egyptians painted themselves with red-brown skin, the same color you still see in the middle and south of Egypt, and even in Senegal, as Moni well knows. When the sort and amount of melanin found in the skin of pharaohs is the same as those of black Africans. Moni still concludes that most Egyptians were Mediterranean whites, twisting or overlooking the facts at each turn, even though they all point the other way. A historian should find out the knowable facts and then make the best sense of them possible, and not force them to fit one's own ideas about things. This is just what Moni accuses Diop of. Written in Paris before 1955, it is necessarily a militant book, impregnated with the spirit of those years of struggle, during which Africans, especially students exiled in Paris in the midst of the colonizing people, were frustrated about their national history, and were preparing the paths of independence by exalting negritude, sometimes, and this is normal, at the price perhaps unconsciously twisting impartiality and scientific truth. They recognized only that which provided arguments for their thesis, their cause. Based on what was known in 1964, Diop said that Homo sapiens came from Africa, that they were black at first and for a long time afterwards and spread across the earth as black people. So there were black people not just in Africa, but in France and Siberia and everywhere in between. It was black people, for example, who took the place of the Neanderthals in Europe. It was only later that people became white or yellow. The bones of early men were most like that of black people alive today, from measurements of legs and arms to all the different measurements of the head and face. On top of that, the art all over the world in those days showed big-bottom women. Even in Siberia. Some white scientists said this was just a worldwide fertility cult that had nothing to do with the way women looked back then. White people, who first appear as Cro-Magnons, came later and are only found in and near Europe. In effect, that makes white people a light-skinned branch of the black race. Some white scientists in his day disagreed with this picture of early men. They found different ways to deny that the first men were black. Mislabeling, they called remains Cro-Magnon simply because they were found in Europe, not because they were in fact Cro-Magnon. Overlooking or twisting facts or picking on little things, trying to avoid the plain conclusion. Putting faith in missing facts, They simply could not believe that the white race only went back 40,000 years. They thought the differences between blacks and whites were much more profound than that, and therefore said that in time far older remains of white people would be found. The true Negro a trick, only black people in one part of the Africa are the true Negroes. It turns out to be the part with the wettest ground and the worst fossil record. That means that people who live in other parts of Africa, like Kenya or South Africa, which have wonderful fossil records, are not true Negroes. Therefore Negroes are merely a branch, not the root of mankind. Diop asks, what if an African ethnologist were to persist in recognizing as white only the blonde, blue-eyed Scandinavians, and systematically refused membership to the remaining Europeans and Mediterraneans, in particular the French, Italians, Greek, Spanish, and Portuguese? This sort of thing is still going on in our time, even though the facts are far more solidly behind Diop than ever. White people draw genetic family trees of mankind where Africa is a branch off to the side, not the root, a root which remains unnamed. The Bushmen of the Kalahari Desert, who seem to be genetically the closest to the root of mankind, are no longer black but some other race, like Capoid.